5 years of darkness taste like earth and rain. 5 years of silence sound like the steady drip of the cavern ceiling and the quiet breathing of her only living anchor, Rook. Elowyn, at 22, knew the contours of her granite cage better than she knew the face of the sun. The world was a gilded viper pit, and the only certainty was the cold, unyielding safety of the Great Scar Cave. She was no savage. She was merely unseen, a daughter of good family who vanished to save her life and protect the secret she guarded. One wet autumn afternoon, the silence fractured. My sweet family. Before Elowyn's story continues, I need to ask you something important. Right now, there's someone scrolling through their feed who desperately needs to hear this story. Someone who feels alone. Someone who's lost hope. Someone hiding in their own kind of darkness. But they'll never find it unless you subscribe to this channel and share this story. Don't let this story die in the algorithm when it could change someone's life. Hit that like button and subscribe so we can reach them together. Now, let's see if the Duke can break through Elowyn's walls. The scent arrived first: fine wool, polished leather, and gunpowder. It was wrong, utterly wrong in this place, where only moss and ancient stone had any business existing. Elowyn's hand froze over the thin rabbit she'd been skinning, her knife going still against the pale fur. Beside her, Rook lifted his small white head, ears pricked forward in a way that made her heart squeeze with terror. The puppy she'd found half drowned in a moorland stream 5 years ago was now a lean, watchful creature who knew silence as their first law of survival. His low growl rumbled through the cave like distant thunder. "Quiet," she breathed, barely a whisper. Her fingers found his scruff, tangling in the coarse white fur. But Rook's body had gone rigid beneath her touch, his dark eyes fixed on the cave mouth, where pale daylight bled into their sanctuary like an invasion. Then she heard it, the crunch of boots on wet shale, confident and unhurried. A gentleman's boots, not the rough tread of a shepherd or poacher. Her breath caught in her throat as a shadow fell across the entrance, broad-shouldered and impossibly tall against the gray autumn sky. The man stepped into the cave mouth, and Elowyn's world tilted on its axis. He was dressed for the hunt, in a deep blue coat that spoke of Savile Row tailors and unconscious wealth, buckskin breeches clinging to powerful thighs, boots that had never known want of proper blacking. Water droplets clung to dark hair that fell carelessly across a brow, too noble to belong to anyone but a peer of the realm. His face was all hard angles, strong jaw, straight nose, eyes the color of storm clouds that swept across her hiding place with the casual authority of a man who owned everything he surveyed. Which, Elowyn realized with dawning horror, he likely did. These were the Lockwood Moors, and standing before her, framed in weak daylight like some avenging angel, was the master of them all. The Duke of Lockwood had found her. Rook's growl deepened, and the Duke's gaze snapped to them at last. Elowyn watched those gray eyes widen fractionally, the only indication of surprise in features that otherwise remained maddeningly composed. She saw herself through his eyes. A wild creature crouched in the shadows, dressed in the remnants of what had once been a lady's traveling dress, now patched with rabbit hide and rough wool, dark hair hanging in a thick braid over one shoulder, a knife clutched in one dirt-stained hand, and a small white dog pressed against her side. "Good God," the Duke said softly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her very bones. "You're real." Elowyn's throat closed. She should speak, should order him away, should do something other than crouch there like a cornered fox. But 5 years of practiced silence had stolen her voice, and terror had stolen her courage. This was how it ended then. One word from this man, one mention to his gamekeeper or steward, and the location of her sanctuary would spread like moorland fire. And then he would find her. The Duke took a careful step forward, hands rising slowly as if approaching a spooked horse. "I won't hurt you." The words were absurd. He was the Duke of Lockwood. He could do anything he pleased. Hurt her, expose her, drag her back to London and the monster who waited there. Her fingers tightened on Rook's scruff until the dog whined softly. "Please," she finally managed, her voice rough from disuse, barely recognizable even to her own ears. "Please go." Something shifted in those storm-gray eyes. Not pity exactly, but something sharper, more dangerous. Interest. Recognition of the quality in her speech, perhaps, or the way she held herself despite the degradation of her circumstances. His gaze swept over her again, slower this time, cataloging details with the precision of a man who missed nothing. "You're gently bred," he said. Not a question, but a statement. "What in God's name are you doing living in a cave on my moorland?" "Your moorland?" The bitterness escaped before she could stop it. "How convenient for you, Your Grace, to own even the rocks under which desperate creatures hide." His expression flickered, surprise again, that she knew his rank. Then something almost like admiration crossed his features, quickly masked. "I own the land, yes, but I've never claimed ownership of the souls upon it." He paused, studying her with unsettling intensity. "How long have you been here?" She shouldn't answer. Every instinct screamed at her to maintain silence, to give him nothing that could identify her or explain her presence. But there was something in his voice, a genuine curiosity threaded with concern rather than threat, that loosened her tongue against her better judgment. "Long enough to know every stone by name," she whispered. "And him?" The Duke nodded toward Rook, who had ceased growling but remained tense against her side. "Your guardian?" "My family." The words hung in the damp air between them, heavy with all they implied. The Duke's jaw tightened, and Elwyn watched him process the meaning, that she had no one else, nothing else, that this small white dog represented the entirety of her world. "I'm Darius Lockwood," he said finally, as if she didn't already know, as if his very presence hadn't already branded itself across her consciousness like a hot iron. "And I'm not leaving until you tell me who you're hiding from." Terror spiked through her chest. "Then you'll be here a very long time, Your Grace." His smile was slight but devastating. "I have nowhere else to be." The Duke did not leave. For 3 hours, he remained at the cave mouth like some immovable sentinel, his broad frame blocking what little daylight penetrated her sanctuary. Elwyn retreated deeper into the shadows. Rook pressed against her legs and maintained a silence so profound she might have been carved from the same granite that surrounded them. She would not speak. She would not engage. She would simply wait until the Duke tired of his aristocratic curiosity and returned to whatever comfortable manor house he called home. But Darius Lockwood, she discovered, was a man of uncommon patience. He settled onto a flat stone near the entrance, seemingly unbothered by the damp seeping through his expensive coat. He didn't speak, didn't demand answers, didn't employ any of the tactics she'd expected from a man of his rank and power. He simply sat, watching the rain begin to fall across the moorland beyond, as if he had all the time in the world. It was unnerving. "You're trespassing," Elwyn finally said, her voice sharp as flint in the darkness. "This is my home." "My moorland," he replied mildly, not even turning to look at her. "Technically, you're the one trespassing." Rage flared hot in her chest, burning away 5 years of careful numbness. "Then summon your magistrate, your grace. Have me removed. Or better yet, leave and forget you ever saw me." Now he did turn, those storm-gray eyes finding her even in the shadows. "I don't think I could forget you if I tried." The words settled over her like a physical weight. She didn't want to be remembered, didn't want to exist in anyone's thoughts beyond this cave. Memory was dangerous. Memory could kill. "I have a knife," she said, lifting the blade so it caught what little light remained. "And I know how to use it." His expression didn't change. "I don't doubt it. You've survived here for years. You clearly possess considerable skill." He paused, his gaze flicking to Rook, who had begun to creep forward with the cautious curiosity of a dog who sensed no immediate threat. "But I'm not your enemy. You don't know what you are." "Then tell me." "No." The word hung between them, absolute and immovable. Elowyn watched the Duke's jaw tighten, saw the flash of frustration cross his aristocratic features before he mastered it. Good. Let him be frustrated. Let him realize she was not some damsel awaiting rescue, but a woman who had made her choices and would defend them with her last breath. "Very well," he said finally, rising to his full height with fluid grace. "I'll leave, for now." Relief and something uncomfortably close to disappointment warred in her chest. She said nothing, merely watched as he moved toward the cave entrance, his boots silent on the stone floor. He paused at the threshold, silhouetted against the rain. "What's his name?" "What?" "Your dog. What do you call him?" She shouldn't answer. Every instinct screamed against giving this man even the smallest piece of information. But Rook had crept almost to the Duke's feet now, nose twitching with interest at the scent of fine wool and leather. And something in her refused to deny her only companion the dignity of a name. "Rook," she whispered. The Duke crouched slowly, extending one hand palm up toward the small white dog. "Hello, Rook. He'll bite you." "Will you, boy?" Darius murmured, his voice dropping to a gentle rumble that made something in Elowyn's chest ache with its kindness. "I don't think so. I think you're a good fellow who's been keeping your mistress safe all these years." Rook's tail gave a tentative wag. Traitor, Elowyn thought, even as warmth flooded through her at seeing her fierce little guardian respond to a gentle hand. It had been so long since Rook had known kindness from anyone but her. The Duke straightened, his eyes finding hers across the shadows. "I'll be back tomorrow." "Don't." "I will. I'll be gone." He smiled then, a slight curve of lips that transformed his austere features into something almost beautiful. "No, you won't. Whatever you're running from, you've chosen this cave as your fortress. You won't abandon it on my account." The accuracy of his assessment stole her breath. How did he know? How could this stranger, this Duke who existed in a world of silk and silver, understand the desperate calculus of her survival? "Please," she heard herself say, hating the weakness in her voice. "Please just forget you saw me." Something shifted in his expression, a softening that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. "I can't do that. But I can promise you this. I won't tell anyone you're here. Not my steward, not my staff, not a single soul. Your secret is safe with me." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why would you do that?" He studied her for a long moment, rain beginning to darken his coat, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her want to retreat further into the shadows. Because whatever drove you to live in a cave for years, alone except for a dog, was serious enough to warrant such sacrifice. And I don't make a habit of destroying what desperate people have built to survive. Then he was gone. Then he, disappearing into the rain and gathering dusk, leaving Eowyn trembling in the darkness with Rook pressed against her legs. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the cave mouth, watching the moorland, waiting for torches, for men with dogs and weapons, for the end she'd always known would come. But the night remained empty and silent, broken only by rain and wind and the steady breathing of her small white guardian. When dawn broke gray and cold across the moor, she saw him. The Duke of Lockwood, true to his word, returning across the wet heather with a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. He walked with the confidence of a man who knew he was doing right, even in the face of her certain fury. Eowyn stood at the cave mouth, knife in hand, as he approached. "I told you not to come back." "You did," he agreed, stopping a respectful distance away. He swung the satchel from his shoulder and set it on the ground. "I brought bread, fresh from my kitchen this morning, cheese, apples, a blanket that isn't rotting from damp." His eyes met hers. "And my word, freely given, that your presence here will remain unknown to all but me. I don't want your charity. It isn't charity. It's human decency." He stepped back from the satchel, hands raised. "I'll leave it here. What you do with it is your choice." He turned to go, and Eowyn found words spilling from her lips before she could stop them. "Why are you doing this?" Darius looked back over his shoulder, rain beginning to fall again, dampening his dark hair. "Because 5 years ago, someone should have helped you, and they didn't." The Duke came every day for a week, and Eowyn's resistance began to crack like ice under spring's sun. He brought supplies each morning, bread still warm enough to steam in the cold air, meat pies wrapped in cloth, once even a small pot of honey that gleamed like captured sunlight. He never ventured past the invisible boundaries she'd established 20 feet from the cave mouth. He simply set down his offerings, nodded to her shadow-wrapped figure, and departed across the moorland with that same unhurried stride that spoke of absolute certainty in his choices. On the 8th day, he brought kindling. Eowyn watched from the cave's depths as the Duke knelt on the damp ground, his fine coat already showing signs of wear from repeated exposure to moorland weather. He'd abandoned his hunting jacket for something more practical, she noted. A dark wool greatcoat that had seen better days, likely borrowed from a gamekeeper. The sight of him, in worn clothing, rather than aristocratic finery, did something strange to her chest. He was adapting to her world, instead of demanding she adapt to his. The fire he built was small and efficient, positioned in a natural hollow between stones that would shelter it from wind. He worked with the easy competence of a man who'd done such things before, despite his rank. When the first flames caught, sending warmth rippling through the damp air, Eowyn felt something inside her lurch with longing so acute it bordered on pain. 5 years since she'd felt true warmth. 5 years of cold that had settled into her bones like a permanent winter. "I thought you might enjoy a fire," Darius said, not looking at the cave but keeping his eyes on the growing flames. "The temperature's dropping. There'll be frost tonight." She said nothing, but Rook crept forward, drawn by the warmth and the scent of the meat pie the Duke had unwrapped near the flames. The small white dog paused at the cave's edge, looking back at Eowyn with liquid brown eyes that seemed to ask permission. "Go on, traitor," she whispered, unable to keep the affection from her voice. Rook trotted forward, tail wagging tentatively. The Duke glanced at him and smiled. a genuine expression of warmth that transformed his austere features into something approachable. He tore off a piece of meat pie and held it out in his palm. "Come here, brave one. You've earned better than scraps." The dog approached cautiously, sniffed the offering, then delicately accepted it from the Duke's hand. Elowyn watched Rook's tail begin to wag with true enthusiasm as he chewed, watched her fierce little guardian, who'd kept her safe through 5 years of terror, melt under simple kindness like snow under sun. "He trusts you," she said from the shadows, the words escaping before she could stop them. Darius looked up, his eyes finding her outline in the cave mouth. Dogs are excellent judges of character, better than most people. Or he's simply been seduced by fresh meat. Perhaps. The Duke tore off another piece, setting it on a flat stone near the fire rather than hand-feeding it. An invitation, Elowyn realized. Not for Rook, but for her. Though I'd like to think it's more than that. I'd like to think he senses neither of you harm. Rook looked back at Elowyn again, then at the meat, then at the fire's warmth. The longing in his small body was palpable. "Stay if you want," she told the dog, her voice rough. "I won't stop you." But Rook returned to her side, pressing against her legs in solidarity. The gesture made her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't afford to feel. Even her dog, given the choice between comfort and loyalty, chose her. The Duke watched this exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read. "He won't leave you," he said quietly, "even for warmth and food. That kind of loyalty is earned, not given. He's all I have." "I know." Darius settled onto a stone near the fire, his posture deliberately relaxed, non-threatening. "Which is why I'm trying to prove you could have more. Not instead of him, in addition to him. I don't want more. Everyone wants more. They just don't always believe they deserve it." The word struck something deep inside her, a truth she'd been avoiding for 5 years. She stepped forward before she could think better of it, drawn by the fire's warmth, like a moth to flame. The light caught her face for the first time in the Duke's presence, and she saw his expression shift as he took in her features, the fine bone structure beneath the grime and exhaustion, the dark eyes that had once sparkled at London balls, the evidence of breeding that no amount of dirt could disguise. "My God," he breathed. "You're beautiful." Elowyn froze, every instinct screaming at her to retreat. But the fire's warmth was a physical caress after years of cold, and her body refused to obey her mind's command to flee. "I'm filthy," she said instead, her voice sharp. "I'm half wild. I live in a cave, and you're still the most extraordinary woman I've ever seen." The sincerity in his voice terrified her more than threats ever could. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how she must appear, dressed in rags, hair tangled despite her attempts to braid it, hands rough from survival. A lady reduced to a creature of stone and shadow. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm something worth saving." Darius stood slowly, his movements careful as if approaching a wild deer. "You are worth saving. Whatever you've done, whoever you're hiding from, you deserve better than this. You don't know what I've done. Then tell me." The invitation hung in the air between them, as tempting and dangerous as the fire's warmth. Elowyn felt words rising in her throat, 5 years of silence pressing against her lips, desperate for release. But fear was a practiced master, and it closed her throat before she could speak. Instead, she knelt and called Rook to her side. The dog came immediately, and together they crept forward toward the fire. Not close to the Duke, she maintained careful distance, but near enough that the flame's heat touched her skin for the first time in half a decade. The sensation was almost painful in its intensity. She closed her eyes, letting warmth seep into her bones, and heard a small sound escape her throat that might have been a sob or a sigh. When she opened her eyes, the Duke was watching her with an expression of such profound compassion that her chest ached. "Stay," he said softly. "Let yourself be warm. I won't move, won't speak, won't do anything but sit here. I promise." And true to his word, Darius remained motionless on his stone while Elowyn and Rook gradually crept closer to the fire, drawn by the most basic of human needs. By the time the sun began to set, painting the moorland in shades of amber and gold, they sat on opposite sides of the flames, a Duke and a cave-dwelling ghost, with a small white dog sleeping peacefully between them. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was the first crack in the fortress Elowyn had built around her heart. The fire had become a ritual between them, an unspoken truce that held through 2 more weeks of the Duke's steady presence. Elowyn found herself watching for him each morning, though she would rather die than admit it aloud. Rook had abandoned all pretense of wariness, greeting Darius with tail wags and small yips of welcome that made the Duke's austere features soften into something almost boyish. On the 17th day, Darius arrived earlier than usual, his expression holding a peculiar intensity that set Elowyn's nerves on edge. "There's going to be a sunset tonight," he announced, setting down his usual offerings near the fire pit. "A rare one. The shepherds are already talking about it in the village. Perfect conditions after the storm. Clear skies, the right kind of clouds." Elowyn remained in the cave mouth, arms crossed defensively. "Why would I care about a sunset?" "Because you haven't seen one in 5 years." His gray eyes met hers across the distance. "When was the last time you ventured beyond the cave after dawn?" "I don't venture beyond the cave at all, unless absolutely necessary." "I know. Which is why I'm asking you to trust me enough to change that. Just for an hour." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "Please, Elowyn, let yourself see something beautiful." Her name on his lips sent a tremor through her chest. She'd never told him her name, but he'd used it for the first time 3 days ago, testing it like a question. She hadn't corrected him, and he'd taken her silence as confirmation. "It's dangerous," she said, the words automatic after years of paranoia. "The sun will be setting. The light will be fading, not harsh, and I'll be with you every step." He held out his hand, though 20 feet of moorland grass separated them. "I won't let anything happen to you." "You can't promise that." "No," he admitted, lowering his hand. "But I can promise to stand between you and any threat. I can promise that if danger comes, you'll have warning enough to retreat. And I can promise that the view from the ridge above the cave is something that will remind you why living, truly living, not just surviving, is worth the risk." Elowyn looked at Rook, who sat at the Duke's feet as if he'd always belonged there. Her small white guardian, who had never wavered in his loyalty, now trusted this man completely. When had that happened? When had the Duke woven himself so thoroughly into their existence that even Rook saw him as pack? "Just to the ridge?" she heard herself ask. "Just to the ridge, 15 yards from the cave mouth. You'll be able to run back if needed." Darius's expression held no triumph, only careful hope. "I'll build the fire first, so you'll have warmth waiting when you return." The preparation of the fire was meticulous. larger than his usual evening fires, built to last and provide heat for hours. Elowyn watched from the shadows as the Duke worked, noting the way his hands moved with practiced efficiency, the way he glanced periodically at the western sky as if calculating time against the sun's descent. When the flames caught and held steady, he straightened and looked at her directly. "The light's perfect. Will you come?" Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to retreat into the granite safety she'd cultivated for half a decade. But something in her chest, some long dormant part that remembered beauty and light and the simple pleasure of a sunset, whispered yes. "If I say stop, we stop," she said, stepping forward into the firelight. "Immediately. And if I run, I won't follow. You have my word?" She emerged fully from the cave for the first time in Darius's presence, and felt his sharp intake of breath as the firelight caught her full figure. She'd washed in the cave's spring that morning, had even attempted to repair her dress with careful stitches. She knew she still looked half wild, but some stubborn pride had demanded she try. "You're trembling," Darius observed quietly. "I'm terrified." "I know, but you're doing it anyway. That's courage." He held out his arm in an old-fashioned gesture of escort. "May I?" She stared at his extended arm as if it were a serpent. Touch, human touch. She couldn't remember the last time anyone but Rook had made contact with her skin. The thought was overwhelming and tempting in equal measure. "I don't need assistance." "I know, but I'd like to offer it anyway." Slowly, as if approaching a live flame, Elowyn placed her fingertips on his forearm. Even through the wool of his coat, she could feel warmth and solidity, the physical reality of another human being. Her throat closed with emotion she couldn't name. They walked toward the ridge, Rook trotting ahead, and with each step, Elowyn felt the world expanding around her in ways that were both exhilarating and terrifying. The moorland stretched vast and purple with heather, the sky opening above her like a cathedral ceiling she'd forgotten existed. When had the world become so large? The ridge rose gently above the cave, offering a panoramic view of the moors rolling away toward distant hills. As they crested it, the sun broke through the clouds on the horizon, and Elowyn stopped breathing. Gold and crimson and violet spilled across the sky like paint from an overturned palette, staining the clouds in shades she'd forgotten existed. The moorland caught fire with reflected light, transforming from dull purple to burnished copper, and the distant hills became silhouettes against glory. It was overwhelming, impossibly beautiful, a reminder that the world contained more than fear and stone and shadow. "Oh," she breathed, the sound breaking on something that might have been a sob. Darius said nothing, but his arm beneath her fingers was steady as she swayed. Tears tracked down her face unchecked as 5 years of carefully controlled emotion cracked apart under the assault of simple beauty. "Why?" she whispered when she could speak again. "Why did you insist on this?" "Because I needed you to remember." His voice was rough with emotion. "I needed you to see that the world still holds light, even if you've been living in mass darkness. It's dangerous to remember, safer to forget. Perhaps. But what kind of life is safety without beauty?" She had no answer to that. They stood together as the sun sank lower, painting the world in ever-deepening shades of amber and rose. And Elowyn felt something inside her shift irrevocably. "Someone wants me dead," she said abruptly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Or worse than dead. Someone powerful enough that my only option was to disappear completely." Darius didn't react with shock or demand details. He simply asked, "Family?" "Close enough. Someone who should have protected me, but instead, she swallowed hard. I had something he wanted. Information. Proof of his crimes. And the only way to stay alive was to become no one, nowhere. And you've been nowhere for 5 years. Yes. Alone except for Rook. Yes. The sun touched the horizon, and the sky erupted in a final blaze of crimson glory. Darius turned to face her fully, his expression fierce in the dying light. You're not alone anymore, he said. And whoever this man is, whatever power he wields, he'll have to go through me to reach you. You don't know what you're offering. I know exactly what I'm offering. Protection, safety, and if you'll accept it, friendship. Elowen looked at his face, painted copper and gold by the sunset, and felt the last of her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. This duke, this stranger who had refused to leave, was offering her something more dangerous than any threat from her past. He was offering her hope. The morning Darius found the locket. Frost silvered the moorland grass like scattered diamonds. Elowen watched from the cave mouth as he approached, noting the unusual tension in his stride. He carried his usual supplies, but something in the set of his shoulders spoke of disturbance rather than the calm certainty she'd grown accustomed to over the past weeks. Rook bounded out to greet him as always, but the Duke's greeting was distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere. He built the fire in silence, his movements mechanical rather than deliberate. Elowen crept closer, concern overriding caution. "What's wrong?" she asked, settling onto her usual stone across from him. Darius looked up, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "I found something yesterday, while checking the rabbit snares you set on the western edge of the ridge." Ice flooded her veins. "What did you find?" Instead of answering, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something small that caught the firelight with a wink of gold. He held it out in his palm, a delicate oval locket on a broken chain, dirt still clinging to the intricate engraving on its surface. Elowen's world tilted sideways. "Where?" The word came out strangled. "Half buried near that old rowan tree. The rain must have uncovered it." His eyes never left her face. "It's yours, isn't it?" She should deny it, should claim ignorance or coincidence. But the locket was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, a gift from her father on her 16th birthday, worn every day until the night she fled London and everything she'd known. She must have lost it during those first desperate days of hiding, when survival had mattered more than sentiment. "May I?" she whispered, extending a trembling hand. Darius placed the locket in her palm, and the weight of it nearly broke her. She thumbed the catch with practiced ease, and the locket sprang open to reveal 2 miniature portraits, her mother on one side, serene and beautiful, and her father on the other, his expression holding all the warmth and protection that had died with him. "They're gone," she said, her voice hollow. 5 years gone. I'm sorry." The genuine compassion in Darius's voice made her chest ache. "But Elowen, the crest on the back, I recognized it." Her eyes snapped to his face. "What?" "The Ashford crest, combined with the Blackwood arms." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "You're Lady Elowen Ashford, daughter of the late Earl of Ashford and Lady Margaret Blackwood. You disappeared from London 5 years ago, and the story was that you'd run off with an unsuitable man. Your cousin Edmund inherited the earldom." Hearing her full name spoken aloud after 5 years of being no one was like a physical blow. Elowen closed the locket with shaking hands, her mind racing through calculations of exposure and danger. "That's the story he told," she said bitterly. "Edmund, cousin Edmund, who was so devastated by my disappearance, who searched so diligently, or so he claimed to society. But he wasn't searching to bring you home safely." Darius's voice had gone cold, the tone of a man assembling pieces of a puzzle he didn't like. "He was searching to ensure you stayed disappeared. He was searching to ensure I stayed dead." Elowyn met his eyes. "Edmund murdered my father. I saw him do it." The words hung in the air between them, 5 years of terrible truth finally spoken aloud. Darius's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands curl into fists against his thighs. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Tell me everything." The story spilled from her lips like poison she'd held too long. How she'd returned early from a ball, feigning illness, and heard raised voices in her father's study. How she'd crept close enough to hear Edmund demanding her father sign papers that would make him heir, claiming debts and disgrace that didn't exist. How her father had refused, and Edmund had struck him, pushed him, watched him fall and crack his skull against the marble hearth. "I ran," Elowyn whispered. The locket clutched against her chest. "I should have screamed, should have called for help. But I knew Edmund had seen me. I saw it in his face when he looked toward the door. That calculation, that coldness. I knew if I stayed, I'd be next, so I took what I could carry and I ran. And he reported you as having eloped. Better than reporting me as a witness to murder. Society believed it. The flighty young girl, seduced by some fortune hunter. My father's death was ruled an accident. Edmund inherited everything." Her voice turned savage. "My home, my fortune, my father's title. Everything that should have been mine." Darius was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as he processed the enormity of what she'd revealed. When he finally spoke, his voice held an edge of fury she'd never heard before. "Edmund Ashford, the current Earl of Ashford. I know him." Elowyn's blood turned to ice. "You know him?" "We move in the same circles. Not friends, but acquaintances. He's in London most of the year, travels to Bath for the season." Darius's eyes met hers, and the intelligence there was sharp as a blade. "He's powerful, well-connected, and absolutely ruthless in business dealings. If he's willing to murder for an inheritance, he won't stop hunting you until you're silenced permanently." "I know. That's why I've stayed hidden. For 5 years, living in a cave, alone." The Duke's jaw tightened. "My God, Elowyn, you were 17 when you fled. 17 and terrified and certain that every shadow held a killer." She laughed, but the sound was broken. "I've become quite accomplished at survival, Your Grace. Give me credit for that, at least. I give you credit for extraordinary courage." Darius stood abruptly, pacing beside the fire with barely contained energy. "But you can't live like this forever. Edmund has to answer for what he's done." "How?" "I have no proof, no witnesses. Just the word of a missing woman against a respected peer of the realm." "Then we find proof." "We?" Elowyn stared at him. "There is no we. This is my burden, my danger. The moment I found that locket, it became my concern as well." Darius turned to face her fully, his expression fierce. "You think I can walk away now, knowing what I know? Knowing that a murderer sits in Parliament while the rightful heir hides in a cave? You must. For your own safety. Damn my safety." The vehemence in his voice startled Rook, who looked up with worried eyes. Darius gentled his tone, but the steel remained. I'm the Duke of Lockwood. I have resources, connections, power of my own. Edmund can't touch me the way he could touch you. You're underestimating him. And you're underestimating me. He crouched before her, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. Let me help you, Elowin. Let me be more than the man who brings you bread and builds you fires. Let me be the ally you've needed for 5 years. She wanted to refuse, wanted to protect him from the danger she carried like a curse. But the weight of 5 years alone pressed down on her shoulders, and the hope in his eyes was a temptation she could no longer resist. If you do this, she whispered, there's no going back. Edmund will know someone is investigating. He'll strike first and ask questions never. Then we'll have to be smarter than him. Darius smiled, and it was a predator's expression. Lucky for us, I've spent my entire life learning how to navigate aristocratic treachery. Edmund Ashford is about to discover that some prey fights back. Wait. Pause for just a moment. If you've made it this far, you're invested in Elowin and Darius's story. But here's the thing. 70% of you are watching without subscribing. That means when I post the next epic romance, you'll probably miss it. And honestly, that breaks my heart. Because I pour everything into these stories for you. All I ask is one small click, that subscribe button, so you never miss a moment. It takes 2 seconds. Elowin waited 5 years for hope. Surely you can spare 2 seconds to make sure you're here for the next story? Thank you. Now let's see what happens when Darius tries to rescue her. The hunting lodge appeared through morning mist like something from a dream. Stone and timber, slate roof gleaming with dew, smoke curling from a chimney that promised warmth and safety. Darius had described it carefully over the past 3 days, painting pictures with words of a small, isolated structure on the far edge of his estate, staffed by only his most trusted gamekeeper and the man's wife. A place where Elowin could be warm, could sleep in a real bed, could begin to heal while they planned how to bring Edmund to justice. It had sounded reasonable when he'd proposed it by the fire. It had sounded almost possible when she'd agreed, exhausted by another freezing night in the cave, worn down by Darius's patient logic. But now, standing 50 yards from the lodge, with Rook pressed against her legs and the Duke's hand gentle on her elbow, Elowin couldn't breathe. Just a bit further, Darius said softly, encouragingly. You're doing beautifully. The walls were closing in despite the open moorland around her. Her chest constricted as if bound by iron bands. The lodge's windows stared at her like dark eyes, and she could imagine Edmund's face in every shadow, his cold smile, his calculating gaze assessing her like property he meant to dispose of. Elowin? Darius's voice held concern now. Are you all right? I can't. The words came out strangled. It's just a few more steps. The gamekeeper's wife has prepared a room. How many people know I'm here? The question emerged sharp as broken glass. Only Thomas and Margaret. I told you they're absolutely trustworthy. You told them about me. Panic was rising like floodwater, drowning rational thought. You told them a woman was coming. They'll talk. People always talk. Edmund has coin enough to buy information from anyone. They won't talk. I gave them my word they'd be dismissed if... Your word means nothing if they're threatened. Her voice was rising, shrill with terror she couldn't control. Don't you understand? Edmund has eyes everywhere. He's had 5 years to build his network, to position his people. How do you know your gamekeeper isn't already in his pay? How do you know this isn't exactly what Edmund's been waiting for? For me to emerge, to trust, to walk into a trap? Darius's face had gone pale. Elowen, I would never. You don't know that. You can't know that. She was backing away now, pulling free of his gentle grip. Rook whined, sensing her distress, pressing closer against her legs. This was a mistake. I should never have left the cave. I should never have trusted. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the terrible thought that he might be part of it, that his kindness might be the cruelest trap of all. Rationally, she knew it was paranoia speaking, knew that Darius had shown her nothing but patience and care. But rationality had no power against 5 years of fear that had calcified into absolute conviction that trust meant death. I'm going back. She turned, stumbling over rough heather. Elowen, wait! Darius reached for her, and she flinched so violently that he froze, his hand suspended in air between them. The hurt that flashed across his face was visceral, but Elowen couldn't stop to acknowledge it. She ran, her ragged skirts tangling around her legs, Rook bounding beside her, the cave calling to her like the only safe harbor in a storm-tossed sea. Behind her, she heard Darius call her name once, twice. Then silence as he honored his promise not to follow. She didn't stop running until she reached the cave mouth, didn't stop until she was deep in the familiar granite darkness, where no windows stared and no strangers waited and no one could betray her. Only then did she collapse against the cold stone wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps that might have been sobs. Rook pressed against her side, whining softly, and she buried her face in his fur. I'm sorry, she whispered to the dog, to herself, to the Duke she'd left standing on the moor. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But sorry changed nothing. The terror remained, absolute and unyielding, proof that 5 years of isolation had broken something fundamental inside her. She'd thought she was surviving, thought she was being strong. But strength would have let her walk into that lodge. Strength would have let her accept help. What she had wasn't strength. It was just fear wearing strength's mask. Hours passed in the darkness. Elowen didn't move from her position against the wall, didn't light a fire or prepare food. She simply sat, drowning in the realization of how thoroughly Edmund had won. He didn't need to find her or kill her. He'd already destroyed her the night he'd murdered her father. The girl who'd run from London was already dead. Only this hollow, terrified creature remained. When footsteps sounded at the cave entrance, she didn't even reach for her knife. Elowen, Darius's voice rough with emotion. I'm not coming in. I'm just going to talk, and you can listen or not as you choose. She said nothing, but she listened. You were right, he continued, and the words held such unexpected pain that her chest ached. Not about Thomas or Margaret. I'd stake my life on their loyalty, and I have, many times. But you were right that I pushed too hard, too fast. I was so focused on getting you somewhere safe that I forgot you've spent 5 years learning that nowhere is safe. That everyone is a potential threat. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant drip of water deeper in the cave. I can't undo 5 years of terror in 3 weeks of fires and conversation, Darius said quietly. I was a fool to think I could. I was a fool to think that just because I know my own intentions are pure, you should trust them. Trust has to be earned, not demanded. And I haven't earned yours yet. Not fully. Elowen closed her eyes, tears tracking down her face in the darkness. So I'm going to do something different, the Duke continued. I'm not going to try to rescue you anymore. I'm not going to make plans or prepare lodges or ask you to leave your sanctuary before you're ready. Instead, I'm going to stay here, on the moor, near the cave. Not inside, I understand that's your space, but close enough that you know you're not alone. You can't, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if her voice carried to the entrance. I can, and I will. I'll set up a proper camp. I'll keep the fire burning, and I'll wait. For as long as it takes, until you believe that I'm not a trap or a threat, just a man who cares what happens to you. The footsteps retreated, and Elowin finally moved, crawling to the cave mouth to peer out into the gathering dusk. True to his word, Darius was setting up camp, not at the lodge, not at his manor, but on the moor itself. She watched him work with efficient precision, erecting a small tent, building a fire, settling in for what looked like a prolonged stay. He glanced toward the cave once, and even from a distance she saw the determination in his face. The Duke of Lockwood, powerful and privileged, was choosing to sleep on cold ground in autumn weather, rather than abandon her to solitude. It was the most foolish, wonderful thing anyone had ever done for her. And as she watched him, something inside her chest cracked open. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of trust. The fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, not everyone in the world was Edmund. That perhaps this man really was exactly what he seemed. Someone who cared. The Duke's encampment materialized over the course of 3 days, transforming from a single tent and fire into something approaching a small military outpost. Elowin watched from the cave's shadows as Darius worked with methodical precision, his aristocratic hands growing calloused from labor he clearly hadn't performed in years. He'd sent Rook back to her on the first day with a note tied to his collar, rough paper inscribed with elegant script that read simply, "I'm staying, no expectations, just presence." She'd kept the note, tucked into the bodice of her ragged dress like a talisman. On the second day, a man arrived, tall and weathered, with the bearing of a soldier and eyes that assessed the moorland with professional wariness. Elowin tensed, reaching for her knife, but Rook showed no alarm. The dog had crept out to Darius's camp that morning and apparently approved of the newcomer, his tail wagging as the stranger scratched behind his ears. "That's Marcus Webb," Darius called toward the cave, somehow sensing her observation, though she'd made no sound. "He served with me in the peninsula, saved my life at Salamanca. If I trust anyone in this world, it's him." Webb glanced toward the cave entrance, gave a respectful nod to the darkness where Elowin hid, then turned his attention back to Darius. The two men spoke in low voices, but the autumn wind carried fragments to her hiding place. Absolute discretion. Edmund Ashford. Evidence of the murder. Anything that proves she's telling the truth. Webb's expression grew progressively grimmer as Darius outlined whatever task he'd been summoned to perform. Finally, the weathered man clasped Darius's shoulder and said something that made the Duke's jaw tighten with emotion. Then Webb mounted his horse and departed across the moor, heading south toward London and whatever dangerous investigation Darius had commissioned. That night, as Darius sat by his fire eating cold meat pie, Elowin crept to the cave mouth. "You sent him after Edmund," she said into the darkness. Darius looked up, unsurprised by her voice. "I sent him to investigate Edmund's affairs. Discreetly. Men like your cousin, men who kill for inheritance, rarely commit just one crime. There will be others. Financial irregularities, perhaps. Associates who know too much and have met convenient accidents. Marcus is very good at finding things people want hidden. It's dangerous," Everything worth doing is dangerous. He poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Besides, Marcus has been bored managing my London properties. He'll enjoy the challenge. He could be killed. He won't be. Marcus is too careful, too experienced. Darius glanced toward the cave. But I appreciate your concern. For him, and I hope for me. Eowyn said nothing, but she didn't retreat into the darkness either. She settled at the cave mouth, letting the firelight touch her face, and watched the Duke who had appointed himself her guardian. Over the following days, the encampment grew more substantial. Darius erected a second larger tent for supplies. He built a stone-lined fire pit that would withstand moorland weather. He constructed a crude but effective shelter for the horses, two now, since he'd sent for his bay gelding to join the stocky moorland pony he'd been riding. "You're settling in for a siege," Eowyn observed on the fifth day, watching him reinforce the supply tent's moorings against increasingly bitter wind. "I'm settling in for as long as necessary." Darius straightened, wiping dirt from his hands. His fine clothes had been replaced entirely now with practical wool and leather, a gamekeeper's wardrobe borrowed or purchased for extended outdoor living. "Winter's coming. I won't have you freezing in that cave while I sleep warm elsewhere. You'll freeze out here too. Then we'll both be cold together." He smiled, but there was steel beneath it. "I meant what I said, Eowyn. I'm not leaving." She believed him. The evidence was everywhere, in the careful way he'd positioned his camp to block the harshest winds from reaching the cave mouth, in the supplies he continued to share without comment or expectation of gratitude, in the sheer stubborn presence of a duke who should have been in London attending Parliament, but instead sat on a cold moor, keeping watch over a woman who'd given him nothing but fear and rejection. On the seventh day, Thomas the gamekeeper arrived with a wagon full of supplies, wool blankets, preserved foods, oil for lamps, even books wrapped in oilcloth. Darius directed the unloading with quiet efficiency, then sent Thomas back with strict instructions that no one, absolutely no one, was to be told of the Duke's location beyond attending to estate matters in the north. "Your staff will talk," Eowyn said that evening, emboldened by a week of Darius's steady, unthreatening presence. "Servants always talk. My staff are paid very well to be discreet, and they're loyal." He glanced at her, his gray eyes reflecting firelight. "Besides, the story is that I'm surveying moorland boundaries and hunting, both of which are technically true. I am on the moor, and I am hunting, for evidence to destroy your cousin. You're sacrificing your comfort for someone you barely know." "I know enough." His voice softened. "I know you're brave and resourceful and have survived impossible circumstances. I know you love that ridiculous dog with a fierce loyalty that speaks to the quality of your heart. I know you were betrayed by family and left alone when you should have been protected. I know that's enough." Eowyn felt something shift in her chest, some final wall beginning to crumble. "Why?" she whispered. "Why does it matter so much to you?" Darius was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice held a rawness she'd never heard before. "Because 5 years ago, I returned from war to find my sister had died. She'd been ill, and I wasn't there. I'd been off playing soldier while she suffered alone." He swallowed hard. "I can't save Catherine, but I can damn well make sure you don't spend another day alone and afraid if there's anything in my power to prevent it." The confession hung in the cold air between them, painful and honest. Eowyn understood then that his determination wasn't about her specifically, or not only about her. It was about redemption, about second chances, about refusing to fail someone who needed protection. She should have felt used. should have resented being someone's path to absolution. But instead, she felt seen, understood. Because wasn't she doing the same thing? Wasn't she trying to survive not just for herself, but to honor her father's memory? To ensure Edmund didn't win completely? "I'm sorry about your sister," she said quietly, "and I'm sorry about your father." They sat in silence after that. Two grief-worn souls on a cold moor, bound together by loss and the stubborn refusal to let tragedy have the final word. As the fire burned low and stars emerged overhead, Eowyn made a decision. She stood, whistled for Rook, and walked the 20 feet that separated the cave mouth from Darius's fire. The Duke watched her approach with carefully controlled hope, not moving, barely breathing. Eowyn settled onto the stone across from him, the same position they'd held weeks ago. But everything had changed. She met his eyes directly and said the words she'd thought she'd never speak again. "Tell me your plan. Tell me how we're going to destroy Edmund Ashford." The smile that broke across Darius's face was like sunrise after endless night. The warning came from Rook. The small white dog had been dozing by the fire when his head suddenly snapped up, ears pricked forward, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Darius immediately went still, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol he now kept within reach. Eowyn, who'd been sitting across from him mending one of his shirts, an intimacy that would have been unthinkable weeks ago, set down her needle and listened. Horses. Multiple horses, approaching from the south at speed. "Into the cave," Darius said quietly, his voice holding the command of a man who'd led soldiers into battle. "Now." But Eowyn was already moving, not in panicked flight, but with cold purpose. She grabbed the small pack she kept prepared for exactly this eventuality and whistled sharply for Rook. "How many?" "At least 4, maybe 6. Darius was loading his second pistol now, his movements swift and practiced. "Could be innocent travelers, on your private moorland, approaching at dusk, moving with purpose." Eowyn shook her head. "It's Edmund. He's found us." The certainty in her voice made Darius look up sharply. Their eyes met across the fire, and she saw him make the same calculation she had. That coincidence had no place here. That only deliberate tracking could have led anyone to this isolated stretch of moor. "Marcus," Darius said grimly. "Edmund must have had him followed when he returned to London. Or your staff talked despite their loyalty." Eowyn had reached the cave mouth, but she paused there instead of retreating into darkness. Her mind was racing through possibilities, through 5 years of intimate knowledge of this terrain. "Darius, the cave has another entrance. A narrow one, barely large enough for a person, about 200 yards north where the ridgeline breaks. Can you reach it unseen?" "In full dark, yes. But they're coming too fast." "Then we don't run." Darius stood, and the transformation was startling. The patient, gentle man who'd brought her bread and built fires had vanished, replaced by the Duke of Lockwood, war veteran and peer of the realm. "We end this. Tonight. Here." The riders crested the ridge as the last light faded from the western sky. 6 men on horseback, and even in the gathering darkness, Eowyn recognized the lead rider's posture, the particular way he sat a horse, like it was a throne. Edmund Ashford, Earl of Ashford, had come to finish what he'd started 5 years ago. "Stay inside," Darius murmured, moving to position himself between the cave and the approaching riders. "Let me handle this." "No." Eowyn's hand found his arm, gripping tight. "He's here for me, and I'm done hiding." She stepped out of the cave mouth before Darius could stop her. standing in the firelight where Edmund could see her clearly. The effect was immediate and gratifying. Edmund's horse shied as he pulled up short, and even across the distance she could see the shock bleach his face of color. "Hello, cousin," Elowen called, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. "You've been looking for me for quite some time, I hear." Edmund recovered quickly, his expression settling into the cold calculation she remembered from that terrible night. He dismounted with practiced grace, his men following suit, spreading out in a loose semicircle that was clearly meant to intimidate. Elowen. Her name on his lips was obscene. I must say, when my man reported that the Duke of Lockwood had taken up residence on his moorland with unusual supplies and secrecy, I never imagined I'd find you here, living like an animal in a cave. How far you've fallen. "Better a live animal than a dead lady," she replied, "though I suppose you'd have preferred the latter." "Careful, cousin. That sounds dangerously close to an accusation." "Not an accusation. A statement of fact." Elowen felt Darius move to stand beside her, a solid presence at her shoulder. "I saw you murder my father. Watched you push him, watched him fall, watched you stand over his body and smile." Edmund's expression didn't flicker. The ravings of a disturbed woman who abandoned her family. Who would believe such fantasies? "I would," Darius said quietly, and the steel in his voice made Edmund's gaze snap to him. "And I'm the Duke of Lockwood. My word carries considerable weight." "Your word about what? A story told by your mistress?" Edmund's smile was poisonous. "Really, Lockwood, I expected better. Though I suppose 5 years in a cave has left my cousin desperate for any protection she can find, even if it means warming a duke's bed." Darius moved like lightning, his fist connecting with Edmund's jaw with a crack that echoed across the moor. The Earl staggered back, and his men surged forward, hands moving toward weapons. "Hold," Darius commanded, and the authority in his voice froze them mid-step. He stood over Edmund, flexing his bruised knuckles, his expression colder than Elowen had ever seen it. "You'll keep a civil tongue when speaking of Lady Elowen, or I'll remove it from your head." Edmund spat blood, his eyes blazing with fury. "You've just assaulted a peer of the realm in front of witnesses. I'll have you brought before the lords. Please do. I'd enjoy explaining why I struck you." Darius smiled, and it was a terrible expression. "Though I suspect you'd rather not have your affairs examined too closely. Particularly not the financial irregularities my investigator has uncovered. The forged documents. The convenient death of your business partner 3 years ago. The debts you've hidden from your creditors." Edmund's face went white. "You're bluffing." "Marcus Webb doesn't bluff, and neither do I." Darius pulled a folded document from his coat. "This is a sworn statement from your father's valet, who witnessed you arguing with the late Earl the night he died, who saw you leave the study with blood on your cuff, who was paid handsomely to keep silent, but has decided his conscience is worth more than your coin." "That proves nothing." "Combined with Lady Elowen's testimony and the evidence of your financial crimes, it proves enough." Darius's voice went soft and deadly. "You're finished, Ashford. The only question is whether you leave this moor in chains or in a coffin." Edmund's hand moved toward his coat, and Elowen saw the flash of steel. "Neither," he snarled, drawing a pistol. Everything happened at once. Darius shoved Elowen aside as Edmund fired, the shot going wide but close enough that she felt the wind of its passage. Rook launched himself at Edmund with a snarl, small teeth finding purchase in the Earl's leg. Edmund screamed, trying to shake off the dog, raising his pistol for another shot. And Elowyn moved. 5 years of survival had taught her where every loose stone lay on this moor. She kicked one up with practiced precision, sending it flying into Edmund's knee. He stumbled, his second shot going wild into the air. Before he could recover, she was on him, her own knife, the one she'd used to skin rabbits and defend herself from wild dogs, pressed against his throat. "Call them off," she hissed, nodding toward Edmund's men, who had drawn weapons and looked torn between loyalty and self-preservation. "Tell them to stand down, or I swear to God I'll finish what you started 5 years ago." Edmund's eyes met hers, and she saw him finally understand that the frightened girl who'd run from London was gone. The woman holding a blade to his throat was someone who'd learned to survive at any cost. "Stand down," he said hoarsely. His men hesitated, then slowly lowered their weapons. Darius had both pistols drawn now, covering them with the easy competence of a soldier, while Rook maintained his grip on Edmund's leg, growling like a creature 3 times his size. "It's over, Edmund," Elowyn said softly. "You're going to confess to my father's murder. You're going to restore my inheritance. And you're going to pray that the crown shows you more mercy than you showed him." In the distance, she heard more horses. Marcus Webb returned from London with a magistrate and constables, his timing impeccable as always. Torches appeared on the southern ridge, official and inexorable. Edmund looked at the approaching lights, at Darius's pistols, at the knife still pressed to his throat. Then he laughed, a broken sound that held no humor. "You win, cousin. Though I wonder if you truly understand what you've won, a life in society's eye, answering questions about where you've been, what you've done. You might find you preferred the cave." "Perhaps," Elowyn said, stepping back and lowering her blade as the magistrate's party arrived. "But at least it will be my choice to make." The morning they left the moor dawned clear and cold. The sky such a brilliant blue it hurt to look at, after 5 years of seeing the world only in shades of gray and shadow. Elowyn stood at the cave mouth one final time, Rook sitting patiently at her feet, and tried to feel something about leaving the place that had been her entire world for so long. She expected grief, perhaps, or nostalgia for the sanctuary that had kept her alive. Instead, she felt only a profound sense of relief, as if setting down a burden she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its weight. "Ready?" Darius asked softly from behind her. She turned to find him watching her with that particular expression she'd come to recognize, patient, concerned, willing to wait as long as she needed. He'd been like that for the 3 days since Edmund's arrest, giving her space to process, to grieve, to come to terms with the fact that the threat that had defined her existence was finally, truly gone. Edmund was in custody in London, held in the tower itself while the Crown assembled its case. Marcus's evidence combined with Elowyn's testimony and the valet's confession had been damning enough that even Edmund's powerful friends had abandoned him. The whispers were already spreading through society, the Earl of Ashford exposed as a murderer and thief, his inheritance built on patricide. "Yes," Elowyn said, and meant it. "I'm ready." She'd taken nothing from the cave except the locket Darius had found, now safely around her neck. Everything else, the makeshift tools, the tattered blankets, the detritus of survival, she left behind. Let the cave return to being just a cave, unmarked by human suffering. Darius had brought a gentle mare for her, a sweet-natured chestnut who didn't shy when Elowyn approached with visible nervousness. It had been 5 years since she'd ridden, 5 years since she'd done anything a lady was supposed to do. Her hands shook as Darius helped her into the saddle, his touch steady and reassuring. "I've got you," he murmured. "And we're going slowly. There's no rush." They rode south across the moorland, Rook trotting alongside with obvious delight at this new adventure. The landscape that had seemed so wild and threatening when Elowyn first fled to it now appeared almost gentle in the autumn sunlight. Heather purpling the hills, the sky vast and open above them. Larks singing in the clear air. Darius had been right that first day, she realized. These moors were beautiful. She'd just been too frightened to see it. The Duke's principal seat, Lockwood Manor, appeared gradually as they crested a rise, first the chimney stacks, then the slate roof, finally the full glory of the Jacobean manor house set in grounds that took her breath away. Even from a distance, she could see the gardens, formal parterres close to the house, then wider pleasure grounds that gave way to parkland dotted with ancient oaks. It was nothing like the cave. It was everything the cave was not: open, bright, beautiful, and utterly terrifying. "Darius," she said, pulling her mare to a halt. "I can't. I don't know how to be that person anymore. A lady. Someone who lives in a place like that." He stopped beside her, his gray eyes understanding. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself. And if living in the manor is too much, I have a cottage on the grounds. Smaller, quieter. You could start there. You've thought of everything. I've tried." He smiled slightly, "though I'm certain you'll find gaps in my planning. You're remarkably good at finding the flaws in my schemes." Despite her anxiety, Elowyn laughed. It felt strange, rusty from disuse, but genuine. When had she last laughed? She couldn't remember. They didn't go to the main house. Instead, Darius led her along a winding path through the gardens to a small stone cottage nearly hidden by climbing roses and honeysuckle. It was picture-book perfect. Mullioned windows, a slate roof, a bright blue door that promised warmth within. "It was my grandmother's retreat," Darius explained as he helped her dismount. "She claimed she needed refuge from my grandfather's hunting parties. I've had it aired and provisioned. It's yours for as long as you want it." The interior was exactly what Elowyn needed. Cozy rather than grand, with comfortable furniture and a fire already crackling in the grate. Someone had placed fresh flowers on the table, and she could see through an open door that the bedroom held an actual bed with clean linens and thick blankets. She stood in the center of the small parlor, overwhelmed by the sheer comfort of it all, and felt tears begin to track down her face. "It's too much," she whispered. "It's not nearly enough." Darius kept a careful distance, respecting her space even now. But it's a start. A place where you can heal, where you can remember how to be Elowyn Ashford instead of the ghost in the cave. Rook had no such hesitation about the cottage. Small Dog immediately claimed the hearth rug as his own, circling 3 times before settling with a contented sigh that made both Elowyn and Darius smile. "He approves," Darius observed. "He's easier to please than I am." "You're not hard to please. You're just careful, and you have every right to be." He moved toward the door, giving her the space she needed. "I'll leave you to settle in. But Elowyn, when you're ready, whenever you're ready, I'd like to show you the gardens. They're at their best in the afternoon light." 3 hours later, after she'd bathed in hot water for the first time in 5 years, after she'd dressed in the simple but well-made gown Darius had somehow procured in her size, after she'd stood before a mirror and slowly recognized the reflection as herself rather than a stranger, Elowyn emerged from the cottage to find Darius waiting on a bench beneath an oak tree. He stood when he saw her, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. It wasn't desire exactly, though there was that too. It was wonder, as if he was seeing something precious he'd thought lost. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "I look like myself." She touched the soft fabric of her dress, still marveling at the sensation. I'd forgotten what that felt like. "Come." He offered his arm in that old-fashioned gesture of escort she'd rejected so many times. "Let me show you the light you've been missing." This time, Elowyn took his arm without hesitation. The gardens were extraordinary, a riot of late-blooming roses and chrysanthemums, ornamental grasses that caught the light like spun gold, carefully tended paths that wound through carefully cultivated beauty. But what struck Elowyn most was the light itself. The way afternoon sun filtered through leaves, dappling everything in gold and green, warm and alive, and utterly unlike the cave's perpetual twilight. They walked slowly through the formal gardens, past fountains and statuary, under arbors heavy with the last of autumn's climbing roses. Rook bounded ahead, investigating every new scent with puppyish enthusiasm, despite his years. And gradually, step by step, Elowyn felt something inside her chest begin to unfurl. She was safe. She was warm. She was surrounded by beauty instead of stone. And beside her walked a man who'd proven with patient, stubborn devotion that not everyone in the world wanted to hurt her. "Darius," she said, stopping beside a fountain where water sparkled in the sunlight. "Thank you for everything, for not leaving, for believing me, for bringing me out of the darkness." He turned to face her, and the emotion in his eyes made her heart stutter. "You brought yourself out, Elowyn. I just held the torch." "No, you were the torch." She reached up, touching his face with trembling fingers. "You were the light I needed to find my way back." For a long moment they stood like that, bathed in golden afternoon light, the fountain singing beside them and Rook playing. At their feet, two souls who'd been lost in different kinds of darkness, now finding their way toward light together. "I'm not healed," Elowyn said honestly. "I'm still frightened, still damaged by what Edmund did and what I had to do to survive." "I know, and I'm not asking you to be healed. I'm just asking you to let me walk beside you while you heal, however long it takes." She leaned against him then, letting herself rest against his solid warmth, and looked up at the vast blue sky above them. No granite ceiling, no darkness, just light and air and possibility. "I think," she said softly, "I'd like that very much." Spring came to Lockwood Manor like a benediction, transforming the gardens into a riot of color that would have seemed impossible to the woman who'd emerged from the cave 6 months ago. Elowyn stood at the window of what had become her permanent suite in the main house. She'd moved from the cottage after 3 months, ready at last to inhabit spaces larger than stone chambers and watch the daffodils dance in the morning breeze. Behind her, on the escritoire, lay the documents that had arrived from London yesterday. Official, stamped with seals that carried the weight of Crown and Parliament, they declared what Darius's investigation and Edmund's trial had proven. Lady Elowyn Ashford was the rightful heir to the Ashford estates, titles, and fortune. Edmund's conviction for murder had voided his inheritance, and everything he'd stolen was being restored to its proper owner. She was a wealthy woman now, an earl's daughter with property and position. She could go anywhere, do anything, be anyone she chose. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 5 years hiding from the very identity that now offered her freedom. "You're thinking too hard again," Darius said from the doorway. And Elowyn turned to find him watching her with that particular expression that still made her heart stutter. 6 months hadn't diminished the effect he had on her, If anything, knowing him, truly knowing the man beneath the title, had only deepened what she felt. "The documents came," she said, gesturing toward the desk. "It's official. I'm Lady Elowyn Ashford again. How does it feel?" She considered the question seriously. "Strange. Like putting on a dress I wore years ago and finding it fits differently now. I'm not the same girl who fled London." "No," Darius agreed, crossing the room to stand beside her. "You're stronger, braver, more remarkable in every way. I lived in a cave and ate rabbits. Society will be scandalized when the truth emerges fully. Society is already scandalized by Edmund's crimes. Your survival in the face of them will be seen as extraordinary courage." He took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Besides, you're forgetting something crucial." "What's that?" "You'll be the Duchess of Lockwood, my Duchess, and I don't particularly care what society thinks." Elowyn's breath caught. They'd danced around this topic for weeks now. Ever since the night Darius had kissed her in the library, and she'd discovered that intimacy didn't have to be frightening when it was with someone who treated her like something precious. But he hadn't formally proposed, hadn't pressed for promises she might not be ready to make. "Darius, I know I said I wouldn't rush you." He turned to face her fully, and the vulnerability in his expression made her chest ache. "I know you need time to reclaim yourself, to figure out who Elowyn Ashford is when she's not running or hiding. But Elowyn, I have to say this, because if I don't, I think I'll go mad." He dropped to one knee with fluid grace, still holding her hand, and produced a ring from his pocket, a sapphire the color of twilight, surrounded by diamonds that caught the morning light. "I love you," he said simply. "I fell in love with you when you were fierce and frightened in that cave, defending your dog and your life with a rusted knife. I fell deeper in love watching you learn to trust again, to laugh again, to let yourself be happy. I'm in love with your courage and your strength and the way you've refused to let what Edmund did destroy the goodness in your heart." Tears were streaming down Elowyn's face now, but she didn't wipe them away. They were good tears, healing tears, the kind she'd learned to welcome over these months of slow recovery. "I don't need you to be perfect," Darius continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't need you to be the polished society lady you were raised to be, or the wild creature you became in the cave. I just need you to be yourself, whoever that is, and let me love you for the rest of our lives." "You're assuming I'll say yes," she managed through her tears. "I'm hoping you'll say yes. But if you need more time..." "I don't need more time." Elowyn tugged him to his feet, her hands framing his face. "I need you. I love you. You gave me back my life, and I want to spend it with you." The kiss was soft and sweet and perfect, tasting of tears and joy and promises being made. When they finally broke apart, Darius slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. "You're sure?" he asked. And the uncertainty in his voice reminded her that even dukes had fears, had doubts, had hearts that could be broken. "I'm sure." She looked at the ring, then at his face, and smiled with the uncomplicated happiness she'd thought she'd never feel again. "Though I should warn you, Rook comes with me, non-negotiable. I wouldn't have it any other way. Besides, he's already claimed the best chair in my study." As if summoned by his name, Rook trotted into the room, tail wagging, and immediately inserted himself between them, demanding attention. They laughed, and Darius scooped up the small white dog who'd witnessed everything. The fear, the hiding, the slow journey back to trust and love. "What do you think, Rook?" Darius asked seriously. "Should I marry your mistress?" Rook licked his face enthusiastically, and Elowyn laughed until her sides ached. The wedding was small and private, held in the ancient chapel on the Lockwood estate with only Marcus Webb and a handful of Darius's most trusted staff in attendance. Elowyn wore a simple gown of ivory silk that felt like clouds against her skin, and carried wildflowers from the moorland mixed with roses from the garden, a deliberate blend of her past and present. When Darius slipped the wedding band onto her finger and spoke his vows in a voice that shook with emotion, Elowyn felt the last piece of her fractured self click into place. She wasn't healed. Healing would take years, perhaps a lifetime. But she was whole enough to choose this, to choose him, to choose a future built on love instead of fear. The wedding breakfast was held in the garden, beneath the oak where Darius had first shown her the beauty she'd been missing. As she sat beside her new husband, watching sunlight filter through leaves and listening to Marcus tell increasingly improbable war stories, Elowyn realized she was happy. Genuinely, completely happy, in a way she'd thought impossible 5 years ago when she'd fled into darkness. "What are you thinking?" Darius murmured, his hand finding hers beneath the table. "That I spent 5 years believing the cave was the only place I could be safe," she said quietly. "That stone walls and darkness were the only protection I'd ever have. But I was wrong. The cave kept you alive. You shouldn't regret. I don't regret it. It served its purpose." But Darius, she turned to look at him fully. This man who'd refused to leave, who'd proven through patient devotion that not all men were monsters, that trust could be earned and love could heal. The greatest safety isn't in stone. It's in you. In this. In knowing that whatever comes, I won't face it alone. His expression transformed with an emotion too large for words. He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with infinite tenderness. "You'll never be alone again," he promised. "Whatever life brings, joy or sorrow, triumph or challenge, we face it together." "Together," Elowyn agreed, and the word felt like a vow more sacred than any spoken in the chapel. As afternoon faded into evening and the garden filled with firefly light, they danced on the lawn with only the stars for witnesses. Rook dozed contentedly in Marcus's lap. Somewhere in London, Edmund Ashford awaited his fate in a prison cell. And here, in the gardens of Lockwood Manor, a woman who'd spent 5 years in darkness finally allowed herself to live fully in the light. Later that night, as Elowyn stood at the window of their bedchamber watching moonlight silver the gardens, Darius came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "No regrets?" he asked softly. She leaned back against him, solid and warm and utterly safe, and smiled at their reflection in the glass. "None. The cave taught me to survive, but you taught me to live. And in the end, that made all the difference. If Elowyn's journey from darkness to light touched your heart, if Darius's unwavering devotion gave you hope, if this story made you feel anything at all, then please, don't just scroll away. Someone you know needs to hear this. Your sister who's going through heartbreak, your friend who's lost faith in love, that person who feels trapped in their own cave of fear. Share this story with them. And if you want more romances that heal your soul and remind you that love is worth fighting for, subscribe and turn on notifications, because I can't keep creating these stories if they disappear into the void. You have the power to keep this community alive. Will you use it? Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing in love. I'll see you in the next story. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.